On the 6th of June 1964, a US Navy RF-8A piloted by Lieutenant Charles Klusman was hit by flak over the Plain of Jars. Klusman ejected, was captured, but escaped 3 months later. The next day, an armed F-8 escorting another RF-8A was also hit and shot down. Lyndon Johnson decided that this escalation required a response and instructed the Air Force to strike back at the communist flak emplacements. This mission was assigned to the 405th Fighter Wing at Clark. It was to be, in the words of the wing commander, Colonel George Laven, one of the worst missions he had ever flown. It was also to be the last combat mission in an illustrious and remarkable career. Officially the last, at least. George Laven is a figure that comes up many times in any research of early Cold War USAF tactical aviation. He was a widely respected pilot and commander. He was also a colourful character who liked to express himself in the extravagant paint jobs he applied to his personal aircraft and in the cars he drove. In many respects, he was the last of a particular breed of aviator, and I feel he should be better known. Tracking his career is also useful to get a perspective about what happened to the Second World War aviators who stayed in service into the Cold War era. As well as his flying career, Laven was instrumental in the introduction of the F-84, F-86H, F-100, F-104 and F-4C Phantom. He also contributed to the development of the A-7 and the F-15. By the time of Vietnam, he was amongst the foremost experts in fighter-bomber tactics in the US military. George Laven Jr. was born in Danville, Illinois on the 2nd of May 1916. He joined the Army Air Force on December 30th, 1940, and was commissioned as a second lieutenant on the 15th of August 1941 at Luke Field, Arizona. He was promoted to first lieutenant on the 17th of June 1942, and appears to have gone to England for a short time before being reassigned to the 54th Fighter Squadron of the 11th Air Force in Alaska, flying the P-39 Airacobra and the P-38 Lightning. The 54th's first operations of the war were against the Japanese force that seized the Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska. Elements of the 54th moved to the airstrip Bulldoze on Adak in September. Laven first appears in the records on the 3rd of September 1942. As part of a two-plane element with a Lieutenant Walton, he flew 600 miles across open ocean on an 8-hour mission to attack Kiska Harbour. When over the harbour, Laven strafed what he described as a 4-engine Kawanishi 97 Mavis and sank it, as well as conducting important reconnaissance of the anti-air and anti-submarine defences. For his part in the operation, Laven was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He was initially credited with the Kawanishi as a kill, but this was later disallowed. Laven disputed this. He named his Lightning Itsy Bitsy, which was his wife's nickname. At this stage he had not established his later predilection for aircraft art, or perhaps he was not yet sufficiently senior to get away with it. Itsy Bitsy was a P-38E, and readily identifiable by the large 76 painted on its nose. On the 14th, Laven was part of a 14-ship fighter sweep supporting a bomber attack on Kiska. Laven claimed his first Nakajima A6M2N roof, a float-plane version of the Mitsubishi Zero that initially confused the US when it was first encountered. Early kills on the type were often chalked up as zeros. The roof had the agility of the early Zero and its comparatively heavy armament of two 7.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons. It was, however, handicapped by a low top speed of only 270 miles per hour because of the drag from the large float. It could outmaneuver the Lightning if a pilot was foolish enough to get into a turning fight, but if he stayed fast then he could employ boom and zoom tactics with relative impunity. Laven flew missions through to December the 1st, when he flew 76 to San Antonio, Texas for repairs. This, incidentally, was a long and treacherous trip for the day. On his return, Laven encountered another formation of roofs on the 13th of February 1943, shooting one down. He also recorded a probable on the same day, which he later decided was confirmed. Japanese records don't tally with this account and show no losses on the 13th. Although its appearance is famous enough to be the subject of model kits, The exact identity of Laven's 76 aircraft is actually a bit of a mystery. He always maintained that it had the tail number 412076. There are, however, no photographs of the aircraft showing the famous yellow 76 and the tail number. This would be no problem was it not for the fact that 412076 was written off in a fatal accident at Olympia, Washington on April the 4th, 1942, in which it crashed into a house. So unless there was another 41-2076, it seems that Laven's plane was a different 76. As it happens, there were two other P-38Es that had the serial number ending in 76, and both were assigned to Elmendorf in 1942. Of these two, more is known about 41-2276. This aircraft had a tragic end. On November the 28th, 1942, First Lieutenant Kenneth W. Ambrose took off from Elmendorf in the aircraft on a flight bound for Plainfield, Washington, where it was to be overhauled and a new fuel tank installed. He failed to arrive and was officially declared missing in action. The wreck was not discovered until 1998. Ambrose had crashed into a steep hillside in the North Cascade Mountains to the east of Mount Baker and was killed. That leaves 41-2176. The official record says that it was stricken on April the 3rd, 1943, but doesn't say the reason. This would fit with history as later in the Aleutian campaign, Laven had another P-30E named Itsy Bitsy, this one with the nose number 80. Yellow 80 was the aircraft that appeared on the cover of Life magazine in August 1943. My conclusion, therefore, is that Laven's aircraft was actually 41-2176. Why would he misremember? Maybe just time fading things, but I think more probably he let a digit slip for another purpose later in his career. After the Aleutians were retaken, Laven remained stateside despite the intensity of the Pacific War. He was promoted to captain in October 1943 and then to major in July 1944. Between these two events, he was involved in the crash of another P-38, an H model, serial 42-66767, at Plainfield on the 28th of December 1943. This accident is a bit confusing as the same aircraft had also been involved in a major incident at Elmendorf on the 1st of December, in which it had been badly damaged when taxiing. Perhaps some repairs were made and then Laven was flying it south for further repairs. Damage was substantial, but the aircraft was repaired again as it was then recorded as being involved in a mid-air collision at Chico on December the 20th, 1944, and then having made a forced landing at Lemoore Air Force Base in California on the 4th of June 1945. Quite an eventful career for that lightning. Going back to Laven, he was doubtless busy in this period, but not really anywhere near the front lines, apparently to his frustration. This changed in March 1945 when he was reassigned to the HQ of the 49th Fighter Group in the Philippines. Here he was assigned a beautiful natural metal P-38L that he christened Itsy Bitsy 2. The flying in the Philippines was principally long-range interdiction, and Laven got a good taste for it. Apparently he destroyed so many trains that he acquired the temporary nickname of Choo Choo Laven. And taking advantage of his seniority to get some flying in, on the 26th of April he encountered a Kawanishi H-8K-2 Emily and shot it down. In George Laven's opinion, this made him an ace. I'd say there's good evidence for 3 kills. 5 would take a very strong wind. He officially finished the war with around 500 combat hours, although I have seen sources that say he had 1,000. He did 168 combat missions. Apparently he was involved in the destruction of 12,000 tons of enemy shipping as well as those trains. Ace or not, Laven emerged from the war as a highly respected officer. The time he spent stateside had undoubtedly added to his reputation as an excellent pilot and an effective leader. Sometime between the end of hostilities and 1947, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel. His next assignment was of great importance to the Air Force. In 1947, he reported to Dowfield, Maine, to become commander of the 14th Fighter Wing. The 14th were the first group in the Air Force to receive the new P-84B Thunderjet. Their mission was to provide protection for the northeastern United States. It was on this assignment that Laven first ordered a personal mount to his aesthetic tastes. His P-84B was named Itsy Bitsy 3, but the assignment was no cakewalk at all. The F-84B had teething problems, and Laven had a great deal of work on his hands to develop practices for maintaining 3 squadrons of novel and underdeveloped aircraft. The skills he picked up would be lent upon by the Air Force in coming years. Truman's defense cuts led to the inactivation of the 14th in October 1949. Laven had by this point moved to command the 525th Fighter Squadron in February of 1949, based at Neubiberg Air Force in West Germany. He carried on this job until October 1950. The next time I can place him is as a full colonel, a rank he achieved on August 1st, 1951. He then commanded the 86th Fighter Bomber Group at Neubiberg, within which the 525th fit, for a short time from October 18th, 1951 to the 16th of April 1952, again flying variants of the F-84. The next major event in the colourful Colonel Laven's career was General Order 62 from Headquarters 9th Air Force, which created the 413th Fighter Group on the 11th of November 1954 at George, with 3 fighter squadrons. Laven assumed command. His group's mission was point air defense and air superiority, with a secondary mission of nuclear strike. Their aircraft was the brand new F-86H Sabre Hog, which, although it bore a close resemblance to the original Sabre, was in essence a totally different plane. It had only just begun to enter service in the fall of 1954. An immediate issue Laven therefore encountered was a distinct lack of aircraft to fly. They did in fact have one Sabre Hog on the 11th of November, but it was on loan from Clovis for the filming of the McConnell story. It remained on base until December and was used to qualify 7 pilots on the type. But getting pilots trained was a major issue. Laven managed to acquire half a dozen F-86Fs in the early part of 1955, but these were only partially useful as the Hog was rather different. Further trouble came from the fact that the 413th had originally been intended to be an F-84F squadron, and thus much of the maintenance and support equipment it had been supplied with was unsuitable for the F-86H. The pilots themselves were a mix of freshly qualified graduates and men converting from obsolete straight-wing types. It was not a particularly impressive example of USAF coordination. Laven's comments in the official history of the 413th bear that out. His entry for the first half of 1955 begins, "If unit histories serve any useful purpose at all, may the 413th be a shining example of how not to do it. Start with the group commander, give him a small office and 66 second lieutenants right out of flying school. Do all of this a month before the organisation is activated." And he went on to describe how the maintenance units were drawn from the people that other units on the base didn't want for various reasons, and how the aircraft they were assigned for training were beaten up, non-authorised for use by tactical squadrons, and in any case they were non-functional when they arrived. His record of the second half of the year suggested that the situation was improving, but the maintenance personnel availability and training was a continuing issue. And the pilot training issues remained too. Although the F-86H was easy for experienced swept-wing pilots to fly, it was very hot for those who had most of their limited hours on a T-33, with forays in an F-84E for gunnery training. Laven had 15 F-86Hs by the end of January 1955, but he had 70 pilots. The number of aircraft built up to 29 in February, then finally another 30 arrived at the end of April, and proper training could begin in earnest. Given the pressure of providing enough flight hours for his pilots to become proficient in the new type, the maintainers had to work excessively hard, and they were also just learning this new aircraft. Things weren't helped by the F-86H fleet frequently being grounded for various niggles, but by August Laven had the 413th fully converted to the Hog. Laven's priorities were somewhat interesting given all the challenges his units faced. Starting in the March of 1955, he had his people apply some of the most flamboyant colour schemes ever seen on a USAF aircraft. Taking advantage of newly developed day-glow colours, the aircraft's tail fin, intake ring, horizontal tail, wingtips and fuselage upper surfaces were given full coverage in day-glow shades of each squadron colour. Nominally, the individual squadron colours were red for the 1st, yellow for the 21st and green for the 31st. Additionally, the forward tips and the fins of each drop tank were painted, and a broad-angled fuselage band in the squadron colour was applied. Squadron commander's aircraft had an additional 3 horizontal lines of colour extending from the fuselage band and 3 colour horizontal tail bands to signify the 3 squadrons of the 413th. The intake ring was also painted with 3 vertical bands on each colour of the squadron CO aircraft. As usual, his tenure with the group was short. He left in October 1955 to become the deputy wing commander in the 479th Wing, a job he started in November. The paint jobs remained for a few years. He assumed command of the 479th in July 1957, setting the scene for his most ambitious paint job yet. The canvas for this project was a box-fresh F-100C Super Sabre, serial 54-2076. Laven wanted this aircraft because his P-38 was supposed to be 41-2076, which, as I have already covered, doesn't tally with the Army Air Force's records. He collected it personally from North American and flew it to George. It was painted with broad rainbow bands on the nose, tail, wings, and a very large angled fuselage band. In this photo, you can also see that he had the drop tanks painted with the same nose and tail detail. You can't accuse him of lacking in attention to detail. Laven would ultimately amass over 2,000 hours in 2076. He was the only US military pilot to fly it. Eventually, it was transferred to a training unit at Luke and then to the New Mexico Air National Guard, and, repainted in a more situational appropriate camouflage, flew in Vietnam. Later transferred to Turkey, it was scrapped in the late 1980s. Laven apparently encountered it in 1983 on a trip to Turkey, and the 30-year-old jet was still going strong. Laven's flight hour accumulation over just 4 years is quite surprising, as on the 16th of November 1958 he got a new hot ride. That was the day that the 479th received the USAF's first F-104C starfighter, immediately nicknamed Really George for the base and the commander. Inevitably, Laven had it painted, apparently despite the significant irritation of the higher command. Because the starfighter had a radar and thus a dielectric nose cone, he was unable to go rainbow there. Instead, he took the opportunity to paint the shock cones in the intake, the nose gear doors and the tip tank noses with the rainbow bands. He refreshed his concept with a block red tail and a prominent fuselage lightning bolt that went nose to tail. After the F-104 experience, the next time we see Laven is at another major milestone in USAF history. On the 29th of January 1962, he went to St. Louis, Missouri to pick up the service's first F-110 Spectre, the artist also known as the F-4 Phantom. He would have likely stayed with the assessment team until at least March 30th, 1962, which was when the initial assessment was completed by the Air Force, who concluded that the F-4 was a really formidable aircraft. They started to place orders. Laven's next assignment was working for Brigadier General Jack Gibbs, himself reporting into the infamous General Momeyer. The task was to assess the suitability of the Air Force's current lineup of tactical aircraft to perform the close air support role in a future war in Southeast Asia. Laven was a central member of the team. He had extensive experience in the F-100 and knew more about the F-4 than most other people in the service. And of course, he had spent a decade leading fighter bomber squadrons by this point. The team's conclusions, delivered in late 1962, were that the CAS requirements for the upcoming war would necessitate a jet aircraft that was dedicated to that mission only. This was due to the unique requirements of the war, such as loiter time, terrain, weather, and undefined lines of battle. Momeyer did not like this conclusion, and he threw it out. It seems likely that this was the first of the 2 black marks on Laven's hitherto exemplary record, which would ultimately prevent him progressing to Brigadier General. His next assignment was as the commander of the 405th Fighter Wing at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, flying the F-100D Super Sabre once again. The powers that be were clearly closing in, as Laven doesn't appear to have painted his ride when on this station. Perhaps this was why his luck deserted him on the 9th of June 1964. He was 49 by then, but still a frontline combat pilot. The TDY squadron at Clark had been on station for less than a week. They had never flown in the Vietnam area, and most of them had never flown a combat sortie. After a relatively vague briefing, Laven led the 7 pilots from Clark to Da Nang on the 7th. There were no recon photos on the approach to the target, but information on the target itself was pretty good. It was a fortress with a 4 or 5 foot thick wall enclosing a small motor pool with vehicles, 1 building, and a 50 caliber machine gun emplacement. Laven was initially allowed to choose takeoff time and weapons load. He went for 2 pods of 19 rockets and 4 500-pound bombs per fighter. He wanted tankers available on the ingress and egress. Expecting to go at dawn, he went to bed early. only to be woken up at 11 p.m. by the commander of the 2nd Air Division, who told him that his ordnance was being changed. Laven disagreed, and a ridiculous 2-day to and fro resulted between the commander on the ground at Da Nang and the White House. It was a sign of things to come. Laven was one of the most experienced fighter-bomber commanders in the world at this point. McNamara had once run a car company. LBJ had once seen a fighter aircraft, but they clearly knew best. The time of attack was also changed. Laven wanted to time the strike to take place between the burn-off of the morning fog and the afternoon thunderstorms, but his desired timing was also overruled so that they would be over the target at the height of the storm system. Even so, Laven took off on the 9th to execute the mission. He split his 8 aircraft into 2 flights, with him leading the first. He instructed the second flight to follow him in and attack the same target. Problems immediately arose. They hit the tankers, and then they asked for the vector to the target, as planned. What target? Was the unhelpful reply. It turned out that the tankers had only been in theatre for 2 days, and they knew even less about the region than the fighter crews. The experienced Laven had fortunately kept track of time and distance, and therefore he had a rough idea of where he was headed, and he set out with his flight in formation. Finally, as he approached Bingo Fuel, he spotted the target and said he was going in. The F-100s rolled in and dropped their bombs, the hopeful rocket pods having been vetoed by the higher-ups. Laven estimated that his flight caused about 40% damage to the target. Unfortunately, there was no sign of the second flight, which had apparently got lost. Laven turned for home, jettisoning a bomb that had hung up en route. Because his wingman didn't have enough fuel to make it back to Da Nang, they diverted to Udon in Thailand. Laven's F-100 had a faulty main gear anti-skid system, so he blew a tyre on landing, delaying their takeoff back to Da Nang. The same thing happened on landing there. It was just one of those days. And it was going to get worse. The post-strike recon photos showed that Laven's initial damage assessment was more or less right. They'd knocked a hole in the wall, hit the ammo storage building, and destroyed some trucks. Unfortunately, having got lost, the other flight had successfully bombed a piece of jungle about 25 miles from the target. Inevitably, this was what the higher-ups focused on. Laven was blamed for the mess. His position as wing commander was cut short by a couple of months. Although a later investigation completely exonerated him, his chances of promotion to brigadier general were now gone. His first job back stateside in the fall of '64 was to work on a task force setting out requirements for the USAF's next air superiority fighter, which would ultimately result in the F-15. After that, he elected to take a slot as senior advisor to the Colorado Air National Guard. He retired in 1969 and became McDonnell Douglas's representative in Israel, a role that he apparently continued to fulfill until at least 1984 or 85. Inevitably, there are rumours that he took F-15s up in combat while in the region, but there is literally no actual evidence of that. Likewise, he didn't sink a Japanese submarine outside San Francisco Harbor in 1942. Being a larger-than-life character, he attracts those kinds of rumours. What he did do is to purchase a wide range of sports cars down the years, including a DeLorean, which he rolled at high speed. He traded in what was left of it for another one in 1983. And while serving in Germany in 1952, he purchased a magnificently ugly Spohn custom car, based around a 39 Ford chassis and a 59 Chevy V8. I believe that both his last DeLorean and the Spohn are still driving around today. He passed away in 1995. His career is pretty remarkable. He isn't as well known a figure as Boots Blessé or Robin Olds, John Boyd or Chappie James, but he was still a significant influence on the US Air Force in the first half of the Cold War, and I think he deserves to be better remembered, both for his skills as a pilot and a commander, as for his art projects. Hopefully this video goes some way to redressing the balance.